Fort Wayne, which covers all of Northeast Indiana. I did a book about the Auburn community and a lot of the historical figures in that. Have done a couple other books, currently working on my first foray into fiction, a historical fiction novel based in 1908 Fort Wayne.
Hi, I'm Barb Olenyik Morrow, and I have written 7 books, fiction, historical fiction, and mainly nonfiction. My area is mainly Indiana history, so I like to delve into that. And my most recent book is Army Guy, Red Cross Gal, so I know a number of you have been to my presentations on that. And I speak pretty extensively around the state of Indiana. I'll go out of state too, but I enjoy sharing history with audiences. So thanks for this chance today.
Okay, first question, and you can answer in any order. If you want to skip the question, that's fine too. But what inspired you to write nonfiction or historical fiction? We can also just go down the line.
I think nonfiction, I have an interest in my life such as a healing ceremony. This comes from ancient India that I found to have profound differences in my life, and I taught it, and then I wrote a handbook for the class, and that ended up being a published book, and it's the only one written in the world on how to do this. It's a well-known process in England and or in Europe and in India, becoming more known in America, but no one had written it down in specifically a handbook and a practical book. So I did that, and I forage for weeds, and I cook with weeds, and I did seminars on it, and people said, would you write a book? So I wrote a book on foraging. So many of my books are having to do with practical application of things that I have applied in my own life and felt like I have the credibility to write about. We also had a training and development firm for over 10 years, my husband and I did together, and with that I also taught different things such as how to deal with depression and how to deal with possibility thinking and all, and so I wrote a book about that. So that's my nonfiction. My fiction, we had a motorcycle. We used to ride across country on the motorcycle. My husband drove, and I rode on the back, and would be very bored sometimes, so I would close my eyes and just imagine things, and one day I was doing that, and I started getting a story that went through my mind. It was like I was watching a movie. And I had never thought to write fiction, but that night when we got to the motel, I told my husband about it, and I said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, but it's a whole movie that played out, and it's got twists and turns, and he looked at me and he said, Ellie, that's a book. Okay, so I agreed. Okay, I started writing that, and I've had 3 more come, so it's a whole series. It's about a woman who meditates and comes out of meditation, and she's not where she was when she started. She's somewhere else. Totally different world, totally different life. She's herself, but she's wearing different clothes. Her body looks different. She's having an experience in a totally different thing, and it turns out she's in a parallel lifetime. So she figures out how to live in it, and in doing that, I went through a journey of myself writing these books. Who am I? How would I live in those circumstances? So I think my fiction is a lot about my own self-processing. Who am I? What would I do? How would I confront these tragedies that show up in my face? War, pestilence, all the different things that show up in a life. How to deal with it in a positive and constructive and the highest possible way. So that was a self journey, and it continues to be so as I write my future books as well.
Well, 43 years ago, I started teaching my teaching career as a 4th grade teacher, and my favorite subject to teach was Indiana history, which they don't even teach anymore. But Indiana history just, I felt it was interesting to me to teach, but it also caught the attention of my students. And talking about especially the Indians and the pioneer way of life here that existed back then. And so my style of teaching was sort of a storyteller. I'll be honest with you, that's sort of who I am. And I could tell stories. Bree probably can testify to that. I would tell stories to make the history come alive and be meaningful to my students. And so I just knew that the day would come that I would write a book. And so when I retired, I took the opportunity to write the book called The Canteen. And just to give you a little bit of a background, the book was based upon a true story in that I have a Civil War rifle that's been passed down in the family since the Civil War. And I'm an heir to it, and now I have possession of it, and it's hanging above my fireplace. And I always wanted to know the history behind that, but it was lost. It was never passed down with the gun. And so I thought, being a storyteller, I'm going to create, based upon history, a story to go along with that. So that's where the historical fiction comes alive. And so I went back, and I won't go into great detail at this time, but I went ahead and came up with a relative, Travis Tipton, and started with him in the Civil War and talked about his journey as he went through the Civil War and what motivated him to join, what experiences he had. And so that's how I got started.
I'm going to be totally honest and share that I was never supposed to write nonfiction. My senior year of high school, I said, I'm going to set a life goal of publishing a book. I want to go into a store, see my name on a cover of a book. That's it. And in my mind, I was this highly I would become this highly successful fiction writer, maybe the next Stephen King or something along those lines. And then I found out how hard it is. But what was it, 2006, I had the opportunity to do baseball in Fort Wayne, which was a nonfiction. It really is to tell the story of the history of baseball in and around Northeast Indiana. And there's so many great things that came from that, and nonfiction sort of became a niche for me. What I'm doing right now, though, is it's interesting because it's sort of coming full circle. When I was doing the research, I learned about the Avalon Hotel fire in 1908 in Fort Wayne. And I always said, I'm going to come back and tell the story about that. And as I started researching it and reading newspapers from the late 1800s, early 1900s, I found out how fascinating the story of the hotel is beyond the fire that is what everyone that knows anything about it, that's all they know is it caught on fire and burned down and 12 people died. There's so much more to that and so much more in our local heritage that needs to be shared and uncovered. And so I wanted to put a narrative fiction account to it to make it more compelling and make it more entertaining. So that's how we got to where I am today.
Switch questions. There's somebody down there. Let's go down there.
I got a little twist on the question here, but I got into this because I had a story that impacted me. And, one thing they tell an author is, write something about something you're really interested in or something you know something about or whatever. But I wanted to communicate my story to other folks to help them. So that was my intention. I told my daughter, one of my daughters, that I was working on this book, and she says, is it going to be fiction or nonfiction? And that kind of stunned me. And I got to thinking about it. Because some of the things I tell in my book could be fiction, that they really did happen. So anyway, but it ended up being nonfiction.
As the oldest member of this panel, I am history. You believe it. I got to sell more books today to be able to afford the T-shirt, but so far, anyway, I haven't said anything about the book. All books are stories. I love this part. Whether you're telling somebody how to cook something, or you've have a great sci-fi story of somebody who's recreated themselves. My story in my books is I was blessed and privileged to lead a small group of spies out of Wiesbaden, Germany, for several years, targeting the Soviet Union in a top secret operation that had the Soviets succeeded in what we were going after, we would have lost the Cold War. No embellishment, no hyperbole, just a factual statement of the background. The book is historic fiction because of a lot of the things were classified away. There's no way I could tell about them. And there were people in the book who were my friends, a lot of them who weren't, are still alive. Most of them are dead now. I soon will be. And I wanted to have their memories, so I have no real names are written in my books, but a real story is there that I thought the American people ought to know about. And bottom line is the results of what we did became a foundation for what President Reagan did with the Star Wars program, which destroyed the Soviet Union, and we won the Cold War. Yeah, but I didn't. Any other? Yeah. Well, it's an honest answer. And as an old case officer, I'm not used to giving honest answers.
I'm going to combine some of the next questions, but that's all right. So you kind of, some of you kind of answered this already, but how do you decide what to write about, and what's your process? So how do you plan? What are your sources for research, and how do you narrow focus?
Well, I think everybody here would probably say, research, research, research is everything. You write about what you know about, but sometimes your memory could be foggy, or you don't know all the names or particulars, so you research. And then you go back and you research some more, and then you turn to libraries, books out there, online. You check online, but you have to verify what you're reading online. You use genealogy centers; they're invaluable, and you talk to people. Research is firsthand gathering of information. That's so important too. So whenever I think, okay, I think I've got it, and then I realize, nope, I have to go back and dig a little farther, gather more information, because then that usually gets me over roadblocks, hurdles. And I know one of your questions, Darcy, is do you get things wrong, or is there conflicting information? And yes, there's always conflicting information. I think as writers, we'd all agree to that. I'm working on something now that I hope will be a magazine article, and I've just been somewhat amused, and I'm interviewing a lot of people, plus I have some written information, and the stories are all different. I mean, what people are giving me. So it's my job to keep tracking it down till I can be pretty comfortable that this is the fact. But history is riddled with mistakes, and that's our job as historians, to correct the record when we're able to.
I could really just echo a lot of what Barb just said. The thing I would add to that is a lot of times the topics find me. It has to be something that I can get energized about and excited about, and just really feel like somebody needs to hear this story, or that others will love to hear this story. And then the trouble is staying on task, because when you're researching one story, you find out about 100 other stories that are interesting. So you kind of have to mentally file those away and say that doesn't work in this narrative or this storyline. So, but I'll come back to that in 3 years. But yeah, that's really where I'm at.
Well, my research was a little different in that I was teaching history for 43 years, and so I was just acquiring a lot of knowledge based upon the Civil War, which is what this book was about. And so there were some things that I did want to research. Number one, the rifle. I wanted to find out where it came from in terms of manufacturing, and it was, and I was able to find that it was a military issue. It was a Savage Arms production, and there were 12,000 of them made, and it was just strictly for the Union Army. So I was able to trace that back. The second one that I really did a lot of research into was Travis ends up in a concentration camp and a prisoner of war camp, and he was, trying to endure through that. But I wanted it to be somewhat realistic, and so I chose Fort Cahaba, which is in Alabama. My initial tendency was to go to Andersonville, which is certainly the one that most everybody knows of, but I wanted to use one that maybe wasn't as well known. And so I did research that particular prison camp and just the conditions that there were there, the people that were in charge, and what it was like, everyday life. And that stuff you can find on the internet, and I was able to do that. So my recent book that I'm writing right now, I'm really very deep into research with the white captives that were taken by the Indians back in the late 1700s. And that's where my next book is going right now. And so going into other books have already been written. Certainly, maybe you're well aware of the Frances Slocum story, the young lady that was kidnapped and taken prisoner by the Delaware Indians. And so that's my next one that I'm working on. And maybe the question that asked what inspired it was just, I like to keep it with local history. And that's what I did with this book. I looked up the Noble County, Indiana 12th Division that represented the Civil War, and Travis was going to be a part of that, and was able to research some of the families and so forth that did serve in that particular unit. And then the book that I'm writing right now all came about because of a rock that was brought to me, and it was about the size of this book. And it was a piece of slate that had been found back in the 1880s. And it was brought to me by a lady after doing one of my presentations on Indian artifacts. And she said, would you look at this? And on this piece of slate was carved the following message: I've been taken prisoner by the Delaware Indians. I've been treated rough. I'm not here. There's another white man with me. His name is Allen, and that is mine. And it was signed J. Allen and E. Allen, 1760. Now that's 40 years prior to white man arrival here in Noble County anyway. And so researching to that has just been really occupying a lot of my time right now, and that's my next story. And again, we don't know, I can't call it, absolutely an honest, true story, the fiction, but it's going to be nonfiction. It's going to be fiction, but it's going to be historical fiction as well.
That's fascinating. I love the variety. I just love the variety. I'm going to be an outlier here because I don't really write historical fiction. I write imaginative fiction. But I do study sometimes history. So my second book, Spirit Dancer, in my Chronicles series, does take place on Earth, but it's a different Earth. It's if it evolved differently historically. But it still has the area of France. It still has certain geographical formations are the same, but the name of the countries and all is different. But I had to have a war scene, so I had a war between Gallia and Turkey, and so I did a lot of research about Turkish soldiers and the history of Turkish soldiers, what they wore, the weaponry they used, the Kabbalabek, which was the major kind of a mortar-launching chemic gizmo they had. So I put that in the book, and then while I happened to hear something I saw something on Facebook about people who lived in an area of Turkey that communicated through whistles. They whistled messages to each other, and I thought, oh, I'm going to put that in my book. So that got in my book. And then I read something about camel wrestling in Turkey, where the camels wrestle each other. And I'm like, no, camels can't wrestle, but they do with their necks. And so I thought, well, how could I put that in the book? But this is where I have to control myself, because you get more information in your research than you can use. So I left out the camel wrestling. But in that, I did some historical study of ancient Greece and how the different continents evolved and the different countries, to see where I wanted to make the split off from the ancient world to the one that I created. So I think my research is mostly, if I want to have a wolf in it, then I'd research wolves. If I want to have some kind of like a horse but different, I'll research horses and horse body language and how they would communicate with each other, and I'll bring that into my book. So my research is sort of like a character shows up, and then I research what I need to know about that kind of character.
My situation and everything that I've heard here resonates with, I think, an author's feeling. I want to communicate as, and this is most terms are kind of squishy of what do they really mean, but I want to communicate in a way that has fidelity in the communication, and particularly in history. Now, having said that, what is fidelity? My old business is a case officer. That's the real name for spies that recruit other people to do bad things. Or we did good things, the other guys did bad things. But we didn't have partners. We weren't like cops. We went out alone, no backup. Nobody was there. So whatever happened when you were out there, you were the historic reference. And so as I was writing, now I was also the operations officer for a number of spies. And we were doing high-tech spying. This wasn't, looking out, counting tanks or something, but we were trying to, what was going to be the determinant of who won the Cold War was whichever side could build a missile defense system. We both had enough missiles to kill each other over and over. One of the most scary things I've ever seen in my life was a movie of what our understanding of what we called the Soviet RISOP, which was the Soviet version of the Strategic Integrated Operations Plan. And what that plan was is how we launched our strategic missiles, the ICBMs, the sub-launch missiles, and the bombers. And you phase these for many reasons. First of all, because they take different times to get to the targets. Sub-launch missiles could get to targets in 4 to 12 minutes. Ballistic missiles, 25 minutes. Bombers, several hours. But you also had the problem of fratricide. When you had big nuclear explosions going off, if you had another one of your missiles in the immediate proximity, you'd blow up, shoot yourself in the foot, except with maybe a megaton. This movie I saw was how we thought the Soviets would attack us. And so they had an outline of the United States, and they showed an accelerated time frame. And you saw the missiles, where we would say under the targeting of taking them out, and Fort Wayne would have been one of the targets based on the number of warheads that they had. And what was scary, and people don't, unless you were in that kind of business, you didn't really think through. We all were worried about nuclear war, but the average citizen didn't understand what that meant. We knew about Hiroshima and so on. But this, as you watch these different warheads, and not even counting the fallout problems, but just actually the explosive damage, everything, and I use that word very carefully, everything east of the Mississippi was gone. Everything. There were no, and you put the fallout in, and it was gone twice. And everything significant west of the Mississippi. It was a terrifying thing to see. That thing in itself was classified, and so you didn't go down to your local theaters to see it. So whoever in this terrible nuclear balance of being able to kill each other many times over, whoever was able to build that strategic missile defense and shoot down the incoming missiles and bombers, they won the Cold War. And that's what that was our mission, was to find out how the Soviets were trying and were they going to be successful in building that strategic missile defense. Research for me was probably one of the worst. I had to do it from memory. But I also contacted a few of the guys that used to work for me, and this is the few that were left, and I had the great fortune of one of my guys, was also my best friend for 50 years, helped me write the first 2 books, but he passed away just as we were publishing the second in the 3-book series. I couldn't go back to classified sources. I didn't have clearances anymore. There's nothing on the internet down at the noise level where I lived, but I could do the broad-based research, but that's not how the book is talking about how we operated on a daily basis. And I had to be careful about classification. I had to be careful about my friends. There were things that I didn't want anybody to know about them that I knew, because they were my friends. They were real people. So when you write these romance things, my job was also security. I had to know where we were having off-color, inappropriate relationships, and yada, yada. That's not in the book, sort of.
Oh, darn.
You're going to have to buy the book if you really want to know.
Well, my story on the research isn't going to be that interesting, I don't think. And that was it. That was very interesting, Gary. First of all, I come from a topic, of health and longevity was my interest, and to help people. And in the swamp of that world, it's all over the parking lot. The information is here, there, everywhere, and you can pick what you like and base what you say on that. It's something like the news. I turn to different channels and I hear the same story 5 different ways. And it's still the same story. And I feel more comfortable when I watch a congressional hearing actually take place than to hear the story about what happened. Because I know that in the hearing I'm seeing what did happen. And I come from a technical and engineering background, so I like data. I like statistics. I'm not fixated entirely on them, but it's not too far away. So I go places, and for preparing my book, I went to U.S. government statistics, and I don't think they're too bad. So, I looked at some longevity data. I think we started getting longevity data going back to 1900. I was telling somebody this morning, the infant mortality in 1900 was 12 to 14%. Today it's 0.7%. And the big question is, how do we get there? And I read articles in the paper today. Well, it's 0.7% today. It's terrible. Well, it's all relative to 1900 when it was 12 to 14%. I have a little story in the book I think I mentioned. In the 1870s, there's some members of my family. The average age of that family was 37. There was the ones that died within the first year, and the ones that lived, and the ones that got past the first year, their average age was 72. Their average age was 37. So I go for data. I wanted to find a group of people that lived longer than other people. Well, I found the group. doggone, they published a big fat book of their statistics and data and how it related it back. So I kind of bought that. Now, I say it's still a swamp because, nothing seems to be definitive in the world anymore. But I tried to go to reliable sources. Now, if I want to talk about a particular way of eating, like a diet or something like that, if you read on the internet, if you go to maybe 50 websites on that subject, you'll find 50 variations of it. So what I did was I went back, where possible, to the original source of the diet to get that information. What did that source say at the beginning? So I dug that out. And I thought I had better information. Whether or not you agree with it, that's another thing. But I dug out the information that, I had talked to people about it and said, oh, you can do this. And I said, no, you can't. So, yes, you can. I saw it on the internet. So researching on the internet is the swamp. And you can't count on anything there. So I tried to base it on the most reliable information I had to try to tell people the story that they probably wouldn't believe anyway, which is why it could have been fiction, as I mentioned earlier. But it's based on fact and experience as best as I could possibly make it. And remember, you are talking to an engineer. And I worked in quality for the last 25 years of my career. And we tried to get to the root of things. But when you're sending bad parts to the customer, you need to find the root cause and not do that anymore. Or you can 100% inspect them, which costs a fortune. Well, we got to the root cause. You fix the root cause, you don't have to inspect them 100%. You save a lot of money. And you save a lot of irritation because you don't want to go visit the customer and have them tell you you had a bad day. So we spend a lot of time digging out the facts, getting out good, solid information, and then let the reader decide.
Let me add one thing to what John had said originally and repeated one point here. And I think, we'll see if everyone else agrees with me on the panel. Some of these things in history are so, I don't like the word unique, it's overused, so singular, like an Indian captives and so on. How did they survive the life that they were subjected to? And it goes almost to the point you say, well, can I really believe that? I don't know whether you read the books by John Eckhart. He was a wonderful writer, which I could write like him, who wrote a series, I think it was 6 books altogether, about the Northwest Territory, but they included in that time Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and part of Illinois. And one of the things, he had a disclaimer. He was a fabulous historian in his own right, but he had a lot of dialogue in his books. And he put a disclaimer in the front that said, nobody knows what these people said to each other around the campfire. It's unknowable. You can research out that forever. It's unknowable. But if you know what was able to be verified of the historic setting, in other words, the historic part of historic fiction, you can have a dialogue there that is credible. You can't verify it, but it's credible. And I ended up doing a lot of that, I will admit. In all honesty, it wasn't exactly the kind of language that we used. We had our own dialect.
So, have you ever learned something while researching your subject that made you completely change your thesis or the direction of what you were writing? Or have you ever not been able to find something you were looking for, and how did you adapt to that?
Quick example. One of my early books, A Good Night for Freedom. It's about the Underground Railroad and 2 runaway slaves. And I initially intended to totally use my imagination. I I was going to read up on the Underground Railroad. There's a house here south of town. It was John Martin Smith's home. And met with John Martin Smith. You know, he showed me in the kitchen the floorboards where it's believed they had hid the runaway slaves. So in my mind, I was going to make up a story about that house. And when I give talks in schools, I show the kids, I wrote chapter after chapter after chapter. I was up to about chapter 8 or 9, and then I like hit a brick wall because I realized this isn't going the way I wanted. So I always tell them I went back to my most favorite place on the planet, the library. I got more books. I read even more about the Underground Railroad. And what was clear is the name of Levi Coffin kept coming up. Levi Coffin is a Hoosier. He was considered president of the Underground Railroad. And I thought, my goodness, I'm trying to write a story about the Underground Railroad set in Indiana, and I don't even have in my story the president of the Underground Railroad. So I took those 8 chapters or whatever and just threw them in the waste can and started over. And instead, I set the story not in John Martin Smith's home, but in Levi Coffin's real home in Fountain City. Today it's a state historic site. It's on the National Register. And, you know, I started reading Levi Coffin's autobiography, and then in that I found stories about the runaway slaves that were in the home. I found he sheltered 2 runaway slave sisters from Tennessee. Now, mind you, he never tells the names of any of these runaways because by nature of the Underground Railroad, it was all secret. But I was able to find a legal case from 1839 in Indiana, and in that case, I found the names of the girls. So that's where I started, here at a home in Indiana, and I just said, nope, that's not the story I want to tell. It's got to have real people in it. So Levi Coffin's in it, the real runaway slave sisters, Susan and Margaret, and the story went from there.
You all familiar with the baseball anthem, Take Me Out to the Ball Game? Okay, ponder that for a minute. The book I'm working on right now, again, 1908, involves a fire in the hotel as well as the recently relocated baseball team in Fort Wayne from Springfield, Ohio. In this narrative, there's the protagonist he's the main guy. He's an aspiring ball player, right? And I always had intended to be his female counterpart, the gal that really didn't have a prominent role. But if I asked you about Take Me Out to the Ball Game, what do you think? You generally probably think, oh, this is about just all the fans of all the world wanting to go out to the ball game. Turns out that anthem was written about a gal named Catherine who wanted to go to the baseball game at a time when girls really didn't go to baseball games. So this girl becomes Katie in my story and actually takes on, kind of subtly, you don't really know, but towards the end of the book, she sort of becomes the main protagonist of the book. So that one little piece of knowledge really transformed the whole direction of the book. So I have a lot of examples like that, but that's one that really stands out.
Well, and isn't the person who wrote the song from Indiana? I think Indianapolis. Yeah.
And had never even been to a baseball game.
I don't have anything.
You're welcome. No, I'm going back to, I'll tell you a little story here. I was talking a few minutes ago about, the infant mortality back in 1900 to today. And when I was starting to do my book, I wanted to go through and try to understand what happened. So my research kind of started with, I just asked somebody, this is, what did that? And people would give me this funny look, like the infant mortality went from, 12 to 14 in the first year to 0.7% today. What did that? I was unable to find one person who could give me any answer whatsoever. So what I thought I would do, this is my original intent now. I thought I was going to go figure that out. Well, I spent quite a bit of time digging and looking and digging and looking. I made charts and graphs. You know, we like data. We like, us engineers and quality people, we like charts and graphs. But I thought I'd look for like the invention of this or the development of that and see what the correlation was. But you know what? It was this. It was just a gradual increase over the years, or gradual improvement, I should say. And of course, as the infant mortality went down, the longevity went up. Since one of my topics was longevity. You know, the greatest single contribution of improved longevity in the United States is due to improved infant mortality. People living beyond the first year. And I go to ask people, nobody has any idea what that is and what did that. Well, I had a devil of a time with that too, and I didn't get comfortable enough with my answer to really elaborate on that like I really wanted to, because I wanted to give good, solid, factual information, because that's just kind of the way I am. But I kind of arrived at, well, to tell you a little scenario. All the time that it was rising, we were attributing, it was in the newspapers. In fact, I got into it with one of the people at the local newspaper up here in Auburn on this subject. But it was attributed to the advances in the medicine and doctors and operations and all of that. Did that change the, longevity improved because of that? If the largest single contributor to longevity was in infant mortality, you think it was medicines and doctors and operations that babies lived longer? You draw your own conclusions. I drew mine. But behind the scenes, I kind of arrived at, there's a lot of things happening in society over those years. We were getting better fed, we were having better housing, we were having better sanitation, we were washing our hands more. There was all kinds of things happening in society that were gradually coming on. And while I didn't put it in the book because I can't really substantiate it, my thought was what was happening was just a gradual evolution of society. And the medical community was part of it. But you notice now that the life expectancy in the United States is dropping. I don't see those articles in the newspaper anymore attributing it to the medical care. And that's a fact. They are not taking the glory for this. So I would assume, I don't know, I haven't researched it, but I would assume that today's decline is lifestyle related.
A comment about research and maybe author insecurity. I can't speak for the others, but when you're writing a book, obviously you like to sell it and get your new Mercedes and all that stuff, or whatever you want. I wanted a Mercedes. I still don't have one. But when I was writing mine, as I said, the research side of it was pretty difficult. But I did have some friends that did help me who were part of the story. In fact, I coordinated with one of the guy's wives about what cover name we would use in the book for her husband. Just as a little side story. But when I went back and read some of the things that I wrote, I said, nobody's going to believe this. I'm not sure I believe it. But it was true. We did crazy things and lived on adrenaline and a little beer. Actually, a lot of both, actually. But the story truth is stranger than fiction for me rings very true.
All right, and I'll ask one more in the interest of time. And actually, as an aside, Gary, your comment about how if you get the historical context right, the dialogue will be believable. That always makes me think of one of my favorite quotes, which is probably apocryphal, by Daniel Boone. So somebody asked him, you know, you're such a great woodsman, have you ever gotten lost? And he thought for a minute and said, I've never been lost, but I was bewildered once for 3 days. So last question, and we'll wrap up. What have you heard from readers about how they interacted with your books, and what impact have you made on readers?
Well, I wrote my book for middle school age children. Being a school teacher of that age level, I connected with them in terms of the books that I used to read to them. As a teacher, I read pretty much every day to my students, whether it be math class or social studies class. But it was nice to get feedback from people after I started distributing the book and getting some letters and texts and so forth from them. But one I'd like to share was from a gentleman my age who said, you know, Trev, I have not read a book since I graduated from high school. And he said, when I picked your book up, I started reading it and read it in one night. Now, it's not that long of a book. It's a short story. But he said, I was just so captivated by it. And I thought, you know, coming from a guy who hasn't read in 40 or 50 years, I took that, you know, as a compliment. But, yeah, it was a win. Yeah, absolutely. But another one I would like to share was the book is heavily captivated or involved with the date of Christmas Day. It starts on Christmas Day and ends on Christmas Day. And Christmas Day was very important. In fact, as we fast forward to 200 years later, 150 years later, I finished the book with John Tipton, my father, reading the book to his grandchildren. And that was recapitulating the book in terms of how it happened and how the rifle ended up where it ended up. And this one gentleman who I don't know very well, but he said, I was so moved by your book that I'm going to read it to my kids on Christmas Day. And so I thought that was for a neat twist to have. So you get a lot of neat comments like that, which have certainly been, appreciative and things that you don't realize maybe when you write the book at the beginning that you're going to get that kind of response. But it's been well worth just that.
I'll try to keep it brief here. My fiction books, I think I've received so many things that surprised me. I think people will tell me they got something out of my book I didn't even know was in it, because we each have our own perspective and we pull that out of what we read. So a woman told me that she was severely depressed because of what was going on in the world. This is 5 years ago, how bad things were and how distressed she was about life and felt so hopeless. And my book was about a woman who lives in an environment that's very challenging, and she finds within her courage and understanding and a way to look for the possibilities and solutions wherever she was at, and that influenced those around her, and then they began to engage with her in that way, and things changed. And that's what the book was about, but she told me that it gave her hope. She said, I cried because I felt like, oh my God, there is hope. And the same book, another woman, totally different, someone gave her the book because she had lost a baby. Her baby lived like a week and then died, and she was bereft, and she'd tried a long time to have that child. And she was so discouraged about life and where was God and all of this. And the book talked about that we are a soul having a human experience. We aren't that human, and when we leave our human form, we go somewhere, and we are in a space where there's possibilities. And I know this because when I was 25, I had a near-death experience where I bled to death, and then I came back. And so I remember what that experience was like. So that was kind of the energy of that, or the message of that was written in this book. And she told me that reading the book, she realized that her daughter was still alive. She just wasn't in form. And she said, she might come again in another form in my life. But I realized that I hadn't lost her. And she said it saved me because I was so despondent. So that came from that. Well, just one more brief one. One of my practical books is How to Do a Fire Ceremony in a Little Copper Pyramid. And it comes from ancient India. And I teach it, and I wrote this handbook, and a man called me from Oklahoma. He said, I'm from Oklahoma, and I live out in the country, and I live out here, and we've got terrible things going on in our neighborhood. We have all kinds of drugs being cooked and down the road, and he was describing what his life was like, and he said, I found this book. He said, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I'm dealing with PTSD from that too. And he said, will this help me? And I said, yes, but you're going to have to prove it to yourself. You need to do it. So I helped him, and he began to practice the ceremony. And he contacted me later, and he said, wow, he said, I'm feeling peace, I'm feeling hope. And he described the change in himself. And he said, and I have neighbors who are calming down. He said, I don't know, it's doing something. And I'm like, okay. And he said, but my wife has to do it, because in the ceremony, you say to do the offering and to do this ceremony with your right hand. And he said, I don't have a right hand. I lost it in Vietnam, so my wife's doing it. And I said, oh, do it with your left hand. Do it. Your heart is the one that's doing the work. Do it with your foot if you have to. Just do it. And so that was very heartwarming to me. I've even had people from India, and it's done regularly there, and everyone knows about it. They have called me and said that book helped them do it, and they're from India. So I've heard from people all over the world. It's just very rewarding.
Excuse me. I had basically two objectives when I wrote this series of 3 books. One objective was to try and impart a look at some history that has been hidden because of classification for 50, 60 years. And the second one is to make the reader enjoy this, because these were real people in here, and we had real people experiences. Some of the feedback I've gotten in both areas was good. Some, they didn't like the way it was edited and yada yada, but we don't want to talk about that.
Okay. I'm in a little different context. I'm talking about health and that sort of thing. And inside my book is case studies. And I know my wife's here, and she always told me, if you want to help people, if you just have one success, then maybe you can have another success. Now, in the longevity world, I don't know anybody that's read my book and says, well, I'm living longer now. But I do have some short-term success stories. We've got somebody here in the area. He got a copy of my book. He got with his son, who was significantly ill, read the book. And I've never met him. But the feedback from Dad is very clear. He's medication-free. He's in good health, and he's avoided potential surgeries. And life and quality of life is so much better. And I think a person that can get themselves healthier and can avoid medications and operations has a better shot at longevity. And, longevity isn't built on, I do all these bad things, and then the last day I get a good surgery, and it's going to keep me going. It's based on all the things you do in your life to build towards that end. So, yes, I've had success stories, and the whole purpose of the book, like I said, was to help people, and some people have been helped. And some people, the people that I've talked to that have read the book said, it made me stop and think. And that's one clear message I've gotten from a lot of people.
Well, my final remark is listening to the variety of stories being told here, the variety of authors saying the response, the feedback they get from readers. I think this is grand testimony to the beauty of public libraries, because we all have different interests. We all have different needs that we go to a library to learn. And so kudos to the fellow writers here, but most especially kudos to our librarians, our library staff, and let us as a community, as a public, do everything we can to support our public libraries. It's the foundation of our democracy, and we need to hold up this institution that promotes openness and knowledge. So that's my thank you for all of you. Did you want to say anything?
Whatever I say is going to just, not to detract. But I do have a very similar sentiment. And again, writing nonfiction, and you mentioned John Martin Smith, and I read in one of his books, it might have been Auburn, the Classic City, where he said, writing about your home community is terrifying, or there's a heavy responsibility to it. And I have found that to be so true, because you want to be able to go home again, right? But what I found, and especially with the baseball in Fort Wayne and the legendary Locals of Auburn, is this sense of community that you may not realize exists until you start really getting engrossed in it. And I've talked to so many folks where they have told me, there's a picture of my grandfather in your book. I'm like, oh, great. And they say, I never saw a picture of my grandfather in a baseball uniform. And being able to help them bridge some connections to previous generations. And a lot of that's true in the Auburn book as well. And one last story about the baseball in Fort Wayne book. I had a coworker, he was a fairly new coworker, came up to me and said, are you the Chad Gramling that wrote baseball in Fort Wayne? I'm like, I'm the only Chad Gramling that I know of, so probably. And he says, oh, my mom, she's a circulation person at the Allen County Library. She gave me your book because they had to retire it because it was overused. And I was like, that's really cool. I will give you a fresh book if you give me that book. And so we did the trade, and it's like my favorite piece of anything that I've collected in my life is that book. So that tells me that it connected, and that was really the goal, is to connect us.
Thank you all so much. That was excellent. Before we shift gears to the end of day drawing, does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Anyone in the audience? I would ask each one of you if you would want to do an oral history recording at our genealogy center. And hopefully, Gary, if you do yours, those won't be subpoenaed by anyone. But so thank you so much for coming. Let's give our authors a round of applause.